I'm going to steal a line from Ron Bain, actually, and say that if I was doing any better, it would be illegal.
You said that a little often lately, John.
Yeah,
You've
well,
said that
it's
quite
a good
bit.
line, and I stole it fair and square, so I'm going to keep running with it.
All right. Thank you guys for joining us for Weekly Whiskey with John and Jay.
Weekly Whiskey is made on Mackie. If you'd like to find out more about the top-notch studio gear we're using, you can check it out on Mackie.com.
Right on. Thank you, Mackie. We have a big one today, so John, let's go ahead and just dive on in. Who do we got going on?
Absolutely. A man who probably needs very little to no introduction at all. We are joined here by the lovely Fred Minnick. Fred, how are you, sir?
Good to see you all. How you doing?
Doing well.
We are doing great. So let's dig in a little bit here. Fred, you're an Army veteran. First of all, I want to thank you for your service. We all appreciate what you've done for us. You have spoken time and time again about your experiences, your battles on and off that particular battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's amazing. You bring a lot of courage to this, and everybody can really kind of respect that you sort of rose like a phoenix, created your own space here afterwards in the wine world and then into the spirits world. Another obstacle after these struggles kind of jumped in the middle of the way, right in the middle of the road for us here, and that's pretty obvious, a global pandemic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Could you reflect on that for us and what the early days of the pandemic were like for you as a globally recognized critic, spirits judge, author, public figure, all the things that you hold near and dear that sort of what you built of your post-military career sort of got shook up. Could you just walk us through that?
Yeah, so when late 2019, I was riding high, just starting the Fred Minnick show. I had just started flirting with YouTube, and I had just come off an event with the Foo Fighters at Bourbon and Beyond, and I had this magazine, Bourbon Plus, which as a writer, having my own magazine was kind of like a dream. And I was the editor-in-chief of it, and it was kind of like, it was my vision, my everything, and so was Bourbon and Beyond from a bourbon perspective. And these cruise ships started getting kind of like stopped at sea, wouldn't be allowed in. We start hearing about all these experts coming out talking about viruses. We were just kind of watching it from afar, and I've seen enough of these like over the years to know when something's like Ebola. What was it called? The Zika. I think the Zika virus.
Yep.
There was any number of SARS. There was avian bird flu. There was all these different epidemics, and this one just felt differently. Because of the way that they were stopping cruise ships, and like the Coast Guard and the epidemiologists, they don't stop cruise ships unless something's really fucking scary.
Right.
And I remember having a conversation with my agent. He's like, we don't really have anything to worry about. Events are going to happen. This is going to happen. It's going to hurt a little bit here and there. And then like a week later, I got furloughed from almost everything. And I went from having a regular salary with the magazine to having a regular, contract salary with like a music company to like, my only income streams were basically Bourbon Pursuit, this new little podcast I started, the Fred Minnick Show, where I was interviewing musicians and tasting whiskey with them, and then a tiny speckle, like a freckle in everything previous, YouTube. And this was in like, I want to say early March 2020. And I'm like, I wake up one day and I've lost 90% of my income. And
Damn.
I'm like, what the fuck am I going to do? What am I going to do? And by the way, my wife, works in a hospital. Not only works in a hospital, but she is in leadership. And, all I can think about is like, what am I going to do if she gets sick? What am I going to do? How am I going to be able to support the family? Because I didn't have, my bread and butter have always, since I was an author, my bread and butter had become events, so basically 2013 on, I had built an events business, that put me in the circles with the likes of Foo Fighters and Metallica, Zach Brown band, things like bands like that, and then it's like I'm like, what am I going to do? Because events were gone, and in magazines, people didn't want things they couldn't touch, and like a lot of things started shifting, and I had no choice but to put my efforts into YouTube and the podcast, and one thing led to another, and I found myself live streaming twice a day on YouTube. My reserves ran out, and I had to furlough my only employee. Fortunately, I was able to recommend her for a position that she still holds, and she's a kick-ass, a barrel brokerage sales rep now. But I had all of these things and happened to me in that time. But from March to May, I was basically doing live stream bourbon tastings or interviews twice a day, or at least once a day, during that entire time. And I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I really didn't. I
remember the early days, man. You were going nuts.
I mean, you go back and look at some of those videos, and like it's the light's blown out, and I'm using the wrong camera. Half the time the mic wasn't on. It's not like it's not like I had someone there to help me. It was just me, and I have a photography background, but not video. Well, maybe a little bit back in college, but nothing that I needed here. And I started learning. I started getting, picking up some steam, and then the musicians started kind of like, some of my music interviews started getting out, and people were like, hey, this is cool. And all these musicians had nothing to do, like nothing. And so it put me in a power seat, because musicians like Mick Fleetwood and Daryl Hall and Killer Mike, who were regularly on the road for tour, they were now like, we gotta like live stream, we gotta do something different.
Right.
And there was this whiskey guy that they heard about, making waves in the music world, doing a podcast. And so everybody wanted to do my podcast. And so 2020 ended up being like this, it went from like, scared to death of what's going to happen to like everything changing for the better. And like when I got to like late May, my agent had, who was going around and selling me to like hotels and bars and restaurants and like music venues, had been in touch with a lot of event companies that were doing private events virtually. And so I started getting booked for private tastings, and the event companies would handle, they would buy and take care of all the alcohol stuff, and I would just show up. I would help them pick what I wanted, and even help them like find a retailer that would fulfill it. And I would educate them, and I would do what I've always done and where my passion is, and that's just talking about the history of bourbon and how to taste, and kind of introducing them to some of my my processes. And then I had this private virtual tasting business like just completely take off, and I was sipping bourbon every night, which sounds like it's a great thing, especially during a pandemic. But boy, did that COVID-20 come real quick on me, and that's the only drawback is like, I did not, prior to the pandemic, I was getting myself back in shape. I was lifting again. I was back to like my, close to my max from college on the bench press. And then it was just kind of the COVID hit, and then boom, I was sipping, bourbon and educating folks, and that was awesome. But boy, I kind of let myself go. I'm getting myself back after a couple injuries, but so that's a little bit of the early days of the pandemic and how I was able to survive.
Yeah, no, that's a great story, and like clearly it's a journey for everyone. Even John and I look back to some of our earliest videos of like we wish we could kind of just erase. We're like, man, we and it's kind of weird for me. Like I have a film background. I'd be like, how am I using the wrong audio source as a film kid? But progress is progress. But I want to dive in a little bit. You talk about YouTube. It's blossomed into this huge thing, and it looks like you're going to hold on to it even past COVID. But folks really, really latched onto that. That was an outlet that I think a lot of people didn't really expect to find good, comprehensive, accurate whiskey information. Were you surprised by how quickly it caught on and grew, or were you determined to make it happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of good creators on YouTube. Actually, I mean, I think Ralphie is an icon in the Scotch side, and and there are different flavors for folks. But I think Bourbon Junkies, Whiskey Tribe, and Mash and Drum, ADHD whiskey. I think they all offer a lot, and folks are educated, and I'm proud that a source of some of that education are some of my books over the years. But I think YouTube, especially at that point, got a very bad reputation for just being bro dudes drinking and having a good time and not conveying a lot of information. And to me, like the pinnacle of whiskey YouTube is it's Bourbon Night, because Chad and Sarah have always had like this rapport with the bourbon community. They're integrated here in Kentucky, of course. And, they've always offered information, and they've given their taste. And if you watch the processes, they're very good tasters. I came into the scene and there had never been, to my knowledge, an author kind of like try to use the platform. I've always been about transparency. I've always been about like, in San Francisco, when I first became a judge, I wrote a story about every single step of the way of how that works. And that was starting in 2013. And I wanted something where I could like, give a little bit of a magnifying glass to my processes, and hopefully, help others. And, and I'm very quick to say I don't like something, but I always try to get people to say like, to understand like I'm one person and you should taste for yourself. But there's so much more to what's frustrating about YouTube is there's so much more to whiskey than does it taste good. But my biggest complaint about YouTube is that it doesn't, the audience who is here for the most part just cares if something tastes good. Like I get to have like, and I do have interviews with like Julian Van Winkle on my channel, and it doesn't get the traction that a review of Pappy Van Winkle would.
Right.
And all people can look at is like, well, does it taste good? Is it worth the hype?
Right.
Instead of learning the history and stuff. And as an author, I guess I have a desire for people to learn and not just like, find out if it's good or not.
Yeah.
And that is, and I think YouTube is evolving to getting more people who are interested in that side. But if you don't have a tasting element to it, if you don't have like the opinion of whether it's good or not, it's dangerous in these here parts because people want to know, does it taste good?
Stay tuned for the end of this video where we taste Pappy with Fred, and he tells us if it's good or not. Fred, you kind of brushed against something there that made me think, I feel like you don't get enough credit for the target that you wear on your back. And by that, I mean the Fred Minnick effect, which I joked about in the intro.
Mm-hmm.
But you know how it is, the Henry McKenna's, this now Seagrass, the amount of abuse that you take for saying that something is good. And then as soon as you say something is good, it doesn't matter how many books about it you've written, about how much of the history you have dug into, how many podcast guests you've had to speak about it. When you say something's great and it sells out, it's just abuse all day. Fucking Fred killed it. He ruined it for everybody. Are there days where you just want to become a recluse and just walk away from the spotlight side of this and just write books about the back end of it, the history, the brands? Or do you still find some passion in the front of the house kind of this?
Yeah, I mean, this has been happening to me since my days at Tasting Panel. When I first wrote about Weller 12-year-old and talking about how like that was like a value, and that was when the bourbon movement was largely led by bartenders, and well, a 12-year-old started really doing well, and there's what's funny is like I said the same thing about Knob Creek in 2015 when it won San Francisco, and I pound it all the time like Knob Creek's better than 95% of the $200 bottles that are coming from source whiskey purveyors, and no one's running out of Knob Creek anytime soon. So right. I think the if I was someone, look, I do care what other people think, but I care more about like my own ethos and ethics, and I take into I think about constantly, like, is this thing, am I tasting this right? Is this am I giving it its proper moment? Is this really better than X or whatever, and I can put my head on the pillow every single night and know that I taste it to the best of my ability, but I can only educate and say it is something is it's to my palate, and that's what something tastes like. And I'm not somebody who's going to, like, if somebody wants to talk shit on me, which I mean pretty much everybody in the space has at some point, I'm not going to be the guy that gets on there and comments. Like, I mean, the only time I've ever done that is when my kids get brought into it, or my wife, or something right. fucked up like that, which that's happened. But no, I mean, I know there will be a time when I step away from being a critic, but you have to put things into perspective. I have been a critic for a long time, but I've usually been somebody else's critic. And what I mean by that, I was Whiskey Advocate's critic, I was Tasting Panels, or I was San Francisco's. It's only been really recently that I've been my own, and I'm able to, and I'm still figuring out like how I want to present this stuff. And of course I have a competition now as well that Jay is a taster on, but this was, I did a top 100. This is the first time I've ever done a top 100.
That was insane, by the way.
And I really like it. I really like it because I'm fascinated with college sports. I love the top 25, and I've always wanted to do a top 25. But as I was putting the top 25 together, I was like, there are so many, 20 through 90 are so close. And there were even some whiskeys that were on the outside of the top 100 that I kind of feel like I should have put in. But at any rate, do I want to be a recluse? I mean, no, I'm a big boy. I can take it. And also, when you put yourself out there, and you've got to expect it, and it's just part of the game. It's part of the game. But I know that, like, for every one of the seagrasses that people bitch about, which that is an insanely varying in opinion product.
True.
And every, like, Russell's Reserve 13-year-old, there's a discovery of Liberty Pole peated rye, or there's a discovery of Kuiper Belt, which was in my top 10, and I get as excited about that as I do declaring the winner. But I'll tell you this, man, I taste this stuff blind. I give it my all, and I'm just one person. And for whatever reason, people listen to me, and I still don't know why the hell they do, But I appreciate it.
You bring up a good point. Like, John and I struggle because people always ask us, like, what are your top 10 this? What are your top 5 that? And it seems like to make it on YouTube, you need a constant stream of the top X or the top Y or the underrated this or the overrated that. And John has a saying that, like, these are the golden days of whiskey. Like, there's just so much good whiskey, and it's so hard for us to put together a list, because even if we come up with 10
By the
or
way,
20...
the late great Dave Pickrell, before he passed away, I mean, he believed the same thing.
Right. It's
Dave.
we live in such a great time with so much great whiskey that it's almost harder to pick your top 20 than to figure out who's, not going to make the list at all. And you could go on all day. And I'm curious, you've got a year, the Ascot's behind you. I'm curious if you learned some lessons about, like you mentioned, you were a taster for San Francisco. Now the Ascot's is your own thing. As you go into year 2, have you learned any big lessons from, like, are brands into it? Like, how did that experience go? And I know I was a taster, but like COVID, we didn't actually sit in the same place. So
there's still, it's virtual again this year, right? So, yeah, I did. And one of the things that I learned is there were a lot, the brands that were like the double platinums. It was like across the board. And then the brands that didn't meddle, one person would like it, one person would be lukewarm, and one person hated it, So what I have found is that, and this is different than me as an individual taster, and I'll give an example of it. Panels are a greater example of what a populace will feel. An individual critic is just that individual. I absolutely loved, still drink to this day, Jefferson's cognac rye finish. So the rye cognac finish. I loved that last year. It made my top 100, and it didn't fare well at all in the Ascots. And so, like, that's a really good example. It didn't meddle, and it made my top 100. So me as an individual loved it. A panel group did not. And so and I've seen this time and time again. When you do panels, you will always be surprised. And even you can taste all day long. When they're blind, you have no clue. You can try to think that you know what you're tasting, and you can try and call it out, and you can bro dude and puff your chest up in the bar all day long in your vest. But when you taste 50 to 300 products, over the course of a weekend or whatever, you are really tapping into your talent. How good of a taster are you? Because if you're a good taster, your palate will be as sharp at 50 as it was at 1. But you got to be focused on how it's hitting the palate. Is it vibrant? What flavors are there? Etc. And that is what I saw was the elite of the Ascots were basically universal from the tasters, and that was a little different for me because I paired tasters based on what they wanted, whereas most competition I've been a part of in the past were just like all tasters were thrown in there. So you might get a gin expert on rye whiskey. Well, that's to me, that's fine. It's still a spirit. You're still getting judged by a professional. I just wanted to be a little bit more lasered in for the Ascots, and so that's what was fascinating for me.
Excellent. Well, it has been amazing to have you, Fred. We appreciate you coming on. We appreciate you being willing to share, a different side, and that's something we really wanted. We wanted to ask you some questions that we didn't feel like were, does Pappy taste great? I mean, maybe we'll get a secret answer to that. But
yeah, the 23-year-old's over oaked usually.
All right.
15-year-old spot on typically, but yeah, 23.
See, we can agree on stuff. I'm with you. Yeah. I think 23 tastes like wood, but it's been great to have you. If folks want to find more info about you, besides typing Fred Minnick into Google.com, what do you have going on? What would you like to invite people to find out?
So you can go to fredminnick.com or any of the social spots. I also have a podcast, The Fred Minnick Show, where I interview musicians and actors and athletes and drink whiskey with them. Started doing that blind now, so I'm putting the guest through the same rigors as like a blind taster in a competition. And of course, Bourbon Pursuit, I'm one of 3 hosts there, and I have a segment called Above the Char where I bitch or or I talk about like some kind of historical element of whiskey. But and on socials, like I'm the blue check mark guy. There's a few different ones out there that aren't me, but Yeah, I mean, really just my name.
Cool. Well, thank you again. It's been awesome.